Hello and welcome back to another build video, and in this one we are going to build this F51 or otherwise known P-51D Mustang from Airfix in 1/48 scale. And let's jump right into the middle by building the cockpit seat, which consists of 3 parts and it has all the details already on it, so you don't have to faff around with any kind of PE sheets or decals. And first, it looks a bit weird and a bit bulky, but I can assure you after it's all painted and weathered up, it looks quite convincing. I think this should be a regular thing with most of the cockpit seats these days. Sadly, there are some ejector pin marks you have to take care of on the cockpit walls before you assemble everything. And as you can see, I did overflow it with sprue glue a bit on that side, but after all, it's going to be sanded down. Now this ejector pin mark is quite prominent, so you definitely have to take care of this. I do apologize for the big jump in assembly. As you can see, I already added the cockpit walls to the fuselage, and if you look closely on the top right corner, you can see that I already added the vertical stabilizer as well, because this kit comes with 2 types of vertical stabilizers depending which version you are building, the P51 or the F51. And because it is the Swedish that I'm going to do, it is a P51. And I was quite satisfied with the cockpit detail. I don't know how accurate it is, but it definitely has a lot of tiny little bits and bobs which make the whole thing a bit more believable and lively. And now I'm adding the radiator intake parts into the fuselage. The instruction sheet would tell you to assemble the radiator intake part separately before you put together the fuselage and then add it into it, but I thought that this is going to be a bit simpler to have these things within the fuselage and then assembled together with it. And of course, as you can see, there were some ejector pin marks within that as well, which I had to fill and clean up. And now we are finishing up the top section of the cockpit. I think that's the radio equipment behind the pilot and the fuel tanks or something. I am not too sure. I haven't looked at the technical drawings of a P51 to know exactly what these parts are, but anyway, those are behind the pilot. That's all I know. Now let's do some priming with my trusty Mission Models Grey Primer. And sorry that I haven't shown too much really of the cockpit assembly, but the thing is that a lot of the recordings weren't that great and usable, so I just excluded them really. You don't really want to watch a blurry mess of flashy blobby hands and some gray plastic. That's really not that fun, I presume, but do let me know in the comments if you would still like to see a blurry mess. I can always add it in next time. And now that everything is going to be covered with primer, let's do some cockpit green from AK 3rd Generation Acrylics. Now I am going to commit some blasphemy here because I'm going to use this cockpit green on the radiator intakes as well. I know that it shouldn't be because that should be zinc chromate yellow, but I'm a bit lazy and it's not going to be visible at all, so green it is. Talking about radiators, after I gave them a nice black primer from Mission Models, I do some dry brushing with some metallic paints. And in this case, it is aluminum. Or should I say aluminium for the non-US viewers. And also you can see that I'm going against the grain, so to speak. And I do live on the edge because that instrument panel is dangerously close. And after that, I'm going to focus on painting the cockpit insides. And first of all, let's do some blacks with a not black, that very dark gray which I used with my previous build, the Yokosuka D4YS Judy. If you want to see that, you can click on the link in the top right corner. And as you can see, there is quite a few surface detail that needs the very dark gray treatment. Now let's do some reds for some of the handles and knobs. Here actually I would recommend you to put down white before putting down the red to make the red a bit more popping, more eye-catching. Which I didn't do, so the reds aren't that great. And as you can see, now I am doing the white. Hindsight for future me, if you ever do whites, reds, whatnot on dark gray or black surfaces, first put down white everywhere, even the ones which are going to be red, and then go over with red, and it will be much nicer. And to drive my point home, you can see how much brighter that red is on that handle, which was just green previously, compared to the ones which are on the dark gray. Now here I use this bone color, this very light brown, to color in that paper that is sticking out from that folder holder over there. I presume it's some kind of flight record holder or something or other, or maybe maps perhaps, map of the area. I don't know what it is, so if someone knows in the comments, please let me know. I might have goofed this up and as I try to paint it as paper, maybe it's something else entirely. And I use the same color to color in this this hose kind of thing, which I presume is for the oxygen mask on the pilot. I saw on some pictures that it's not this light brownish color, but I still went with it because I just wanted to break up the monotony of the whole insides, just to have a bit of extra color, that like a lighter color that gives more depth to the insides of the cockpit. And then of course I use that color again to color in the harnesses. And you can also see here that on the backrest I gave an dark brown treatment for the padding. And here I use that same very dark gray to color in the headrest. I saw it on some pictures that it's black, but I thought that it might fade a bit during the constant exposure to sunshine, especially I think the cockpit glass would make things worse, the bubble canopy, and it would actually make the leather, I presume it's out of leather, a bit lighter in color over time. And now what I do is that I use a light brown color to color in the cockpit floor, which, if I understand correctly, was wood. And I also know that it was covered with like a black anti-slip coating, but what I wanted to do is to have regular wood surface. And here I also use a bit of soft tone acrylic wash from Gargoyle Paints. This will give an interesting tonal, oops, almost dropped it, an interesting variation in the look and feel of it. And then I use the same soft tone to smother the backrest and the harnesses on the pilot seat. I will be honest, I quite like these washes and speed paints and whatnot that you can find in the miniature painting scene. So I highly recommend to have a look around and play around with these kind of paints, because they can be a great asset for us modelers as well. The only downside compared to doing oil paint washes is that because it's water-based, it can dry quite fast, and then you can't really move that around anymore as you would do with oil paint. But on the other hand, you might be able to do different kinds of techniques with it, like for example having clumps of paint mimicking some wear and tear, for example. So that's that. But let's move on and let's glue in the painted radiator intake into its place. Just a tiny amount is enough, because it is going to be all closed up, and frankly you're not going to see too much of this. Let's see, this is how it looks in place. Now let's turn back and continue working on the cockpit floor. And now I'm using a lighter shade of brown and try to mimic wood grain by just gently stroking the surface and leaving some paint behind, like that. It's not the best, I know, it looks a bit jank, but we are not finished yet. Now I use this soft tone again and just slobber it on a bit and see how it will look. This is really just an experimental phase for me, because you know the cockpit is going to be closed up, so not much is going to be visible of this anyway. So I thought that it is going to be a good place to do some experimentation. And that's what we do here right now. But we are not going to stop here with the soft tone, because eventually I wasn't too pleased with the outcome. I think this soft tone is too soft for my taste, and that's why I am going to use a more darker tone on it. And yes, you can see here that, you know, after the soft tone has dried, it's not as dark. It is light, and it really didn't gave too much depth to the wood grains, so to speak. That's why I try this darker tone and see where it gets me. And I also let it pool up here and there into little clumps of blobs of paint. I don't really mind. Again, I'm just testing things here, seeing how things work. And of course I would show it off if the camera wouldn't be blurry. Here you go. Again, it doesn't look that great, but we are not done yet. So let's move on and do some decaling work, namely on the instrument panel. And needless to say, because it's Airfix, all the decals are made by Cartograph. And that means exceptional quality. And I also use the usual suspects here: some water, and then microsole and microset. And of course, in usual Airfix fashion, they really supply a ton of small detail decals like stencil information, be it outside or even inside in the cockpit. Now this tiny one was a bit tricky because this is actually, if you look closely, it's a handle, and that little decal goes onto the handle itself, and because the shape of the handle is round, the surface is very much curved, it is a bit finicky to get it right on there. And as you can see, Airfix really takes its decals seriously. The right hand side of the cockpit has 4 tiny decals, and we are not even finished yet, because we still have the left hand side to worry about. But before I forget, I do want to mention that before I did the decaling, I did seal everything with a gloss varnish from VMS. You can see how shiny it is. And you might have also noticed that the guy here really takes its time with these tiny decals. It's just had a bit of a kerfuffle positioning it properly, but in the end I succeeded. Okay, this thing here I don't really recommend. This is a white Penoline wash from AK Interactive. It is very similar to the one that you would get from Tamiya, the Tamiya Penoliner. And this is the white version of it, and I'm trying to do some penolining here, some highlighting on the black, and first of all it's not going to look great, so I'm not recommending doing this, not because of the AK thing, but because it's white on black. It was a stupid move, but I will have to try to live with it. Second of all, these penoliners are very thinned down. They are not that great, mind you. And third, look at that applicator brush at the end. It's horrible. It's crinkled, crooked. It's I don't know what AK has done, but this is horrible. You are better off making your own wash with oil paint. And now I am using the sepia one. It's a light brownish color here on the bottom of the cockpit area. And again, not impressed at all. It's too thin. The solution is just too thin. It doesn't have enough pigments to actually make the details pop. I don't know if the rest of it is like that, but the white one, this sepia one, and I have a darker brown one, are just horrible. First of all, yes, I wanted to get a black one as well to try to use it as the Tamiya Penoliner. Well, I don't have Tamiya Penoliner, mind you, but I was very intrigued by this AK one, and I was hoping to get similar results what you can see with other model makers using the Tamiya Penoliner, but it's not great. I tried to use it here on the seat to give a bit more depth to the cushion, but again, it's just I don't know. Maybe it has its applications. Maybe if you just want a really subtle highlight, then it's good. But yeah, if you want to have like the panel lines and the edges and everything like really popping, then this is not for you. I am very unimpressed, and I do not recommend it to anyone at all. But of course, if you had good experience with it, then yeah, it's all power to you, my friend. Use it to your heart's content. But for me, it just doesn't work. But because I'm a stubborn mule, I was like, okay, let's try to finish this up with this Penoliner and I will try to make the best of it. Well, let's say you should be the judge how good or bad it is. But after I've done everything on the cockpit insides, including the wash, and I sealed the deal with some matte varnish, now I am doing the usual thing that many other people do, is to put some UV resin, clear resin, into the instruments on the instrument panel and then cure it to give this nice shiny gloss effect to it. It's quite simple. I just use my handy dandy homemade applicator tool to drop a tiny drop of resin in there. Nice and easy. And of course, if you're asking what kind of brand I use the Bondic resin. You can get it from Amazon, eBay, and probably like any other home DIY kind of shops, stores. And it has its own little UV curing lamp. It's quite simple to use actually. I quite like it. Of course, I'm not using it for gluing because that would be crazy, right? I'm only using this for these instrument panels. And now let's put everything together by gluing in the instrument panel. Looking okay so far. Let's glue in the pilot seat. And of course, now you have some time to judge how well I did with the wooden cockpit floor. I was satisfied, I'd say. It's not my best work, but it's decent enough for me. And again, other than you, the viewer, is not going to see it at all. I'm not going to have people standing line in front of my house to look at my models on the shelf. But that would be great, because then at least I would ask for some entrance fee and I would be quite well off. But sadly, that's not the case. And whilst I was rambling about what ifs and other shenanigans, this guy here is assembling the fuselage halves and glues in the cockpit in the middle. Like that. The fit is okay. There are going to be some problems in form of gaps that I will need to address with some sprue glue, but more on that later. Here let's use some masking tape to keep everything together while the cement dries. There are some hard to reach finicky parts of the fuselage, like the underside radiator intake. And here I want to mention that during assembly I did see that, although I'm not complaining about the amount of detail, surface detail that is, on this kit, but it does lack some of it here and there. Most prominently, what I have felt that is missing is that the bottom of the radiator intake has some detail, some rivets and some other stuff, and it's completely missing here. Whilst, for example, on the Tamiya 1/72nd scale Mustang, you have all of it there. Anyway, let's focus on the wings now. And before we assemble the wings, we want to have a bit of fun with the navigation lights. Well, no, sorry, these aren't specifically navigation. I think these are formation lights. And first we glue in the nice see-through plasticky part, and then I use these Posca pens to color them in. I will use yellow, green and red. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, these Posca pens might not be the best thing in the world for this kind of work, because as you can see, it has a bit of hard time to stick to this very shiny surfacey plastic. But in the end, it will manage. I just had to take my time with it and wait until it properly dries before I go over a second or even third coat, which will be needed with the green. As you will see, the green had a bit of trouble going down. But as you can see here, already it looks quite nice. I quite like the result, but let's see how everything else goes. And as I said, the green had a bit of trouble sticking, but a bit of convincing and relentlessness did do the trick in the end. Probably with a different kind of marker, with the new AK ones, probably this is not going to be such a big issue, or wouldn't have been such a big issue, as I think those are lacquer based markers and the Posca pens are regular water based, but don't quote me on that one. Anyway, you can see that the green is not that great for now, but the red goes down like a champ, and yeah, the coverage of the red is quite good as well. It's really interesting that the green had a bit of trouble, because yellow is a more nefarious color, so to speak. A lot of times yellow's coverage is really bad, and then you have to have some white undercoat to make the yellow look nice, which I'm going to eventually do. I'm going to do an undercoat, which is a top coat in this instance, but already you can see that it looks decent. I quite like how this whole thing came to be. And yeah, as you can see, this is the end result. And you can see that the green is now really nice and covered. And now, as I said, I'm going to do a white under overcoat in this instance, and just, yeah, doing some multiple passes here as well. Just making sure that I'm not pushing it too much down, so I'm not lifting up the paint underneath or do anything crazy. Just nice and easy. Yeah, looking sharp. And now comes the assembly. As I said, there is nothing really outstanding with the wings. One thing to know, that you want to make sure what you want to do initially when you're building this plane, because you have to do some drilling if you want to put in the fuel tanks or the rockets or whatnot, which I didn't do at all. And then later on, at the end, I decided that I actually like the fuel tanks. I do want to have some fuel tanks as well. I do have the P-51 from Tamiya in 1/72 scale, although I don't have a video of it, sadly. But I did the same mistake with that as well, that initially I didn't want the fuel tanks, but then later on I decided for it, and then I had to second guess where the fuel tanks might go and how. And that's not fun. So please, before you build anything, make sure you know what you want to do. And now let's put these two things together. It does need a bit of convincing, but it slots right into place like that. I quite like the engineering on this one. It's really simple and it looks great right out of the bat. And luckily there aren't any misalignments, gaps whatsoever. So +1 to Airfix. Now comes the bottom part of the cowling, and that just falls into place like that. No problems whatsoever. Except for that gap on the front part, but nothing serious that one couldn't fix or manage. Now let's attach the horizontal stabilizers. And now comes the top part of the cowling. Here as well, it wasn't that perfect. There were some gaps that needed filling, but again, nothing serious that you couldn't handle. Strap yourselves in, boys, because now comes the fun part, which is making this landing gear cover fit in its place. I will give Airfix 100, plus 100, or even a plus 1000 for the effort to give us the option for a closed landing gear with literally every kit they have, because that's fantastic. You know, I really applaud them for that, and all the other manufacturers should follow suit. But with this kit, it looks like something went really wrong on the engineering side, because this piece of plastic just wouldn't fit in its place. I had to shave off a lot of plastic to make it fit. Not just in depth, so not just due to its thickness as it should have been, but all the sides. I literally had to shave and sand all the sides of this plastic piece to fit in its place, and it was a struggle because I had to make sure that I keep the symmetry and the form correct so I don't end up with massive gaps either of its side. My second option would have been, if I would have failed with this one, is to try to reassemble a closed landing gear from the parts which are provided for the gear down position. Maybe I should have started with that, perhaps, when I saw initially that it's not going to be a good fit, and maybe try that, and maybe that would have been good. I don't know, because I never really tried. In the end, luckily it worked out well, so I never needed to resort to plan B. After I was happy with the outcome, I glued in the magnet for my stand, which I'm not going to use a pin on this bird, I'm going to use it with a magnet. And with some super glue and some activator, everything is swell. And afterwards, I did glue it in. But of course, not everything was perfect, and there are some gaps that will have to be taken care of in the near future. But after this big piece of work, I continued moving on with the rest of the build, which is the nose, a bit more nose thing here, and after the nose came the ailerons, and these can be positioned freely because they have no tabs or locator pins or anything like that, which is quite good if you would like to put the plane into a roll or any other flight position. You can do that with this. The same goes for the rudder, that can be moved about, but here I'm just putting it into a simple straight position, but as you can see it's quite finicky because you have to hold it with one finger in place and then glue it like that. And now come the elevators. These were again no tabs, nothing, so you can't position them. So yeah, you have freedom of movement pretty much with every control surface. Now come the guns, and they are not the best. I think they could benefit from a third-party aftermarket upgrade, if there are any. But anyway, I've put them in place, and you can see that there is a bit of a gap. Well, on the underside there, that's quite nasty, but it is going to be taken care of eventually. And now comes another less fun part, which is using my trusty sprue glue to fill in any gaps or misalignments, which was very prominent here at the end of the fuselage on the bottom. And then you have a nice big gap here that you need to fill on the radiator intake. But the worst offender was, I think, on the top. And I've been trying that to fix, just, you know, trying to put things together proper, the whole fuselage, but somehow that gap was always there. So it might be an engineering problem, but maybe it's just me. But anyway, I filled that in, and here you have to take care that you're not going to fill in accidentally the hole for the radio mast. After the sprue goo has fully cured, we use our trusty Revell scraper and scrape off all the excess. And of course, afterwards, we are going to do some sanding as well. And after all of this, we rescribe the last panel lines. First, I use my trusty saw blade because I find it much easier to do a straight line with that one. And when that's done, I go in with my panel liner tool, which I don't have in recording, so you have to imagine me doing that. Sorry. But after all that's done, we use some cement to soften up the edges and melt away all the roughness and excess plastic in the panel line. One thing to note here, that when you have sprue goo as well on the model in some parts, you don't want to dabble too much with the cement, because what I found is that these sprue goos parts, so the plastic is although cured, it's not that strong as the plastic that it has been untouched. So that means that it can melt much easier. So you don't want to melt the sprue goo too much, just a tiny amount of cement and then it should be done. It's probably because the plastic was melted for so long in the bottle and stuff like that, that the molecular structure is a bit different. Although it still has seemingly the same properties as raw plastic would, but it's not the same. But that's what I found, at least. But anyway, in the meantime, I was rambling about sprue goos and such. You can see me finishing up the stuff. So I closed up the rear landing gear, and now I'm putting the front part of the radiator intake in place. And now finishing up the back part of the radiator, and this tiny part on the very bottom is fixed. You can't really position that, although I don't know if that's actually positionable in real life on the aircraft. But the bigger flap that goes on the back, that one, that can be positioned into open. I think it's open and closed, maybe half closed as well. But yeah, I went with the closed position. I am that lazy, yes. And after those things were done, I scoured the whole body for more things to fix, and I found that nasty gap right there at the wing root. Luckily, of course, sprue goo can help with this one as well. And yeah, by the way, this is on both sides, sadly. Now one might think that as we closed up the fuselage and put everything into place that we are finished with the cockpit, but that's not the case with this one, as we still need to do the targeting sight. And now, without using any primers, because I'm a bit impatient and lazy, I just cover the whole cover. I think it's some kind of cover for the instrument panel because it's on top of it. So I covered that with some dark gray, which I like to use instead of black, which I mentioned quite often now. Anyway, after it's covered, I am going to do some dry brushing on it as well to make it look a bit nicer. Of course, I'm going to use the same dark gray to color the targeting sight's bottom part. Now here I'm also coloring in that U-shaped thingamabob which is in the canopy behind the pilot with some cockpit green. Now let's use some medium brown to color in the leather padding on the front of the targeting sight. Now let's do the dry brushing which I mentioned before, and with some lighter grays I gently dry brush the top surface of that cover to highlight those small edges and thingamabobs on the surface. Looks much better now. And here it is glued into its place, which is the frontal part of the canopy, which has a bit of the cowling as well together with it. And don't worry, you can use regular cement because that part is going to be covered up with paint. And now we are gluing that into place as well. And finally, we can say that the cockpit is fully finished. But hold on, there is more. There are two more tiny parts that go into the canopy, which are in some respect a part of the cockpit. And yeah, as you can see, I did struggle a bit to put this into position, but this is the less problematic part of that structure. This U-shape was way more annoying than that back part, and yeah, I fast forwarded because I didn't want to bore you with how to put it in, but yeah, you have to take your time with this one. But with those two in place, we can finally close off the cockpit. One of my favorite parts is like finally having all those things closed up and not having to worry about, except if you have some holes somewhere that will have paint going into, and then you have an all fogged up canopy inside, or you accidentally glue the canopy on and then you realize that there is a massive speck of dust or a bit of hair or something in there. But anyway, let's move on for some more sprue gooing on the nose of the, let's say, the bottom of the cowling. And then there are some parts where sprue goo is not the right answer, and in that case I use this water-based putty from Vallejo. And grabbing my trusty silicone brush or sculpting tool, I apply that liberally to the place where it needs to be, and in this case is the front part of the canopy and between the fuselage. There is a bit of a gap that I want to have gone before painting, and you just massage the whole thing in as much as possible, and then you wipe the excess off with a cotton bud dipped into regular tap water. And after that we move on to the bottom of the plane, namely to the closed landing gears, because if you remember I said that there are some gaps that need filling, and these are the gaps which need filling. And this kind of putty is really good to use it on gaps which, well, you want to retain, so you want to still be like a panel line. And when you fill this putty in, remove the excess, let it dry, then it shrinks a tiny amount so the gap will be still there in a form of a panel line, shall we say. With sprue goo it would be much harder, because then you would have to sand it down completely flush with the surface and then rescribe the panel line. With this one you fill in the gap, and then you will have a tiny bit of panel line thing going on that you can then do or, well, use later on in the panel line wash session. And now I am filling in these tiny holes which are on the bottom of the wings, and these are for the rocket pods. But as far as I know, Mustangs in Swedish service never sported rocket pods, or I don't think that they had these rocket pods in World War II, so I just filled them in with sprue glue. These rocket pods are for the Korean War version if you're building that, and I'm not doing that. And now I'm doing the thing what a normal human being would have done, is to drill out these holes for the fuel tanks before they assemble the wings, but I'm not a normal human being apparently, so I'm doing it afterwards. Luckily one of the holes is on the outside, as you saw. Just using that and just making sure that this fuel tank holder is properly aligned should do the trick. But yeah, if you're a normal human being and you know that you want to have fuel tanks, then just drill them out before you assemble the wings. And even if you change your mind later on, you can always fill it with sprue glue and then sand it flush and really avoid any headaches. And now, as I directed my attention to the fuel tanks, I saw that when you put the two halves together, they are really sitting flush. But as far as I know, the sides of the fuel tanks where they fit should have some kind of panel line or something else. So what I do is that I take my trusty scraper and I scrape along the edges of both sides, doing like a 45-degree angle, and do some chamfering, so to speak, on the edges. And when that's done and you put the two halves together, you have a nice deep panel line. So you don't have to do it after assembly with a scriber or something. See? It's that easy. Looking nice. But after I looked at this image, I realized that I don't really need a panel line, rather I need this edge kind of thing running along the fuel tank, which is, I presume, used to weld the two halves of it together. So I started to contemplate what to use and how to do and so on and so forth. And I decided to use green stuff to actually mimic this thing. And by green stuff, I mean the Green Stuff World 2-component putty, which I massaged into one, as you can see, and it has this nice deep green color afterwards. And I used a bit of water and these two sheets to make a really long spaghetti kind of thing. And it needs to be really thin. And use a bit more water, just regular tap water, you know, so it doesn't stick that much. It's not easy. It's not easy. I've been struggling a bit. You can see others using this kind of method with the same type of putty to create like weld beads and whatnot on their tanks. But here I'm using to create that weld edge along those drop tanks, those fuel tanks. So anyway, I was massaging it away to create this really thin spaghetti. And later on, as you can see, I just realized that it's much easier just to use my hands and just gently stretch it out without tearing it. And after I'm done with the spaghetti making, I take a long strand of spaghetti and put it into the groove. Just nice and steady. It's a bit finicky because it doesn't stick too well to the plastic at this stage, so you have to be a bit patient and everything, but sooner or later we get there, I promise. So let's use the magic of editing and then just jump a bit. And now we jump to the part where I cut off the excess and make it long enough to cover all the way. Like that. Nice and easy. Yeah, there's a bit of a bulge, but you can trim that in the end. Now a bit of a love tap, just to make sure that it stays in place. A bit of massaging, looking decent. And this is how it looks after I let it cure for a whole day. It's not perfect. It has a bit of an unevenness to its surface, but what we can do now, because it's completely cured, we can go and do some sanding like this. So I tried to sand the edges nice and flush, and just to make it look decent. And of course you can see here that what I've created is a bit more thicker than what's on there in real life, but it's better than nothing, right? And after that was done, I moved on to mask the canopy with my usual way to mask it off, with thinly cut Tamiya masking tape right along the edges, and then filling the rest in with masking liquid. Luckily, masking the Mustang is one of the easiest things in the world, or at least for now I haven't come across anything that would be easier to mask off. It's definitely not a B-17, that's for sure. Finally, we have arrived at the painting phase, and using AK 3rd generation acrylic paint for the cockpit internals, which I'm going to apply on the outside of the canopy. Because I'm not going to paint the inside of it, so we're going to apply it on the outside. This is for, you know, when you look into the canopy, the cockpit, and you see the canopy edge where the frames of it are, then you will see the proper color on the inside of it. And I just apply it generously. Do double check if the coverage is okay, because it sometimes can be tricky on the eye that you look at it and it looks completely opaque, but it's actually not. And when you hold it up against the light source, you can see that the layer is very thin and the light can shine through. So I do recommend to give multiple generous passes to it. And when that's done, I break out my trusty Mission Models black primer and just prime the whole plane into black. And that's good for metallics, of course, because this whole plane is going to be then covered with aluminium, or aluminum for the Americans. And of course, I will do the usual thing. What I do is to promote Mission Models paints, or at least, well, I'm not being paid, sadly, to promote them, but if anything else, I think their primers are one of the best acrylic water-based primers on the market. I tried others, and so far Mission Models did the trick, and I highly recommend it. I am going very thick with the primer, and the reason why I'm doing this, because I noticed if you are going very wet with the primer, then this black primer does try to a satin finish, which helps a lot. So I don't need to go over it with a glossier black paint or something. And yeah, it's quite a decent primer. And of course I'm going to use AK Extreme Metals, which is an enamel paint, so I leave this paint to completely dry before I do that, which is going to be now. And I'm using aluminium, or aluminum for Americans. And yeah, I'm just going ham-fisted on it, because that is such a great paint. This Extreme Metal, again, I think I praised it enough in my previous videos, but I just cannot stop praising these two. This is one of the best metallic paints, I think, which well, yes, I know there are like the alclad ones and whatnot, but for now I use this, and this just does the job. And it's not lacquer based, it's still not that friendly as a water-based one because it's enamel, so it's still stinky, but much better than lacquer-based ones when you consider any kind of health risks as well. Now we are going to switch to matte aluminum, or aluminium for the non-Americans, and we are going to use that on some of the control surfaces, namely on the ailerons and the rudder, and of course the flaps as well. The elevators are going to get a different type of treatment. And besides some of the control surfaces, I'm going to use the same paint to spray down the fuel tanks. Now, using dark aluminum, we are going to give a bit of a variation to the overall look of the plane by using that on the panels covering the gun ammunition on the wings on both sides. And of course that is going to be used as well on the elevators. Next up, we are going to use steel, for the Americans also steel, to color in the cowling where the exhaust is. And with that, the whole thing is pretty much done. Well, when it comes to metallic paints, that is. Next step is to seal the steel with some gloss varnish from VMS. To be fair, you don't really have to do this part because we have enamel paint on the top, which should hold nicely against anything like, for example, the decal fluids, liquids that you use like setter and fixer liquids, but I just want to have a nice shiny finish on the whole surface. And the same goes for the drop tanks as well. And now, after everything has cured properly, we get to the, well, in some extent it's fun part. I do like decaling, especially when the decals are so good and the cartograph ones, then I have no problems to faff around with the decals. And of course you have a lot of extra stencil data as well, which is quite common for Airfix, and another +1 point for that. And the Swedish markings are quite big, so you want to use a lot of decal setting solution underneath. And when you lift it up, just make sure that you don't have it fold in on itself, because nothing is more infuriating to try to smooth out a folded up decal. Trust me, I had that multiple times happening to me, but I think most of you will know how that feels. And because these are quite big, you have to take extra time to make sure that both of them are properly aligned, because then it is quite apparent if not. And after everything looks okay, I just use my trusty cotton bud and just squeeze all the liquids out underneath. And here's, well, first you just roll. You don't rub because then it moves. You roll. And when the rolling is good and it seems like that the decal is properly stuck to the surface, then you rub, because then it's not going to move at all. Like that. Now we are rubbing. So don't forget, rolling, then rubbing. And also what you can do is to cut into the decals along the panel lines with a fresh blade. And it's not necessary all the time. You should be the judge when it comes to it. But sometimes not all the decals sit properly into the surface, and then you might miss out on some of the detail. And after that you use the fixer liquid. In this case it's Microsol, but other brands call it Decal Fix and whatnot. Now I haven't recorded it, but I also did this anti-glare coating of the cowling, and I'm just unmasking it for your viewing pleasure. It's a dark olive green color. And of course on top of the paint I also applied a coat of satin varnish from VMS. You can see that I use different types of tape. So for the outline I used this flexi tape from Tamiya because the surface is a bit curved, so using regular masking tape wouldn't do the trick. That's why you want to use these flexi tapes first, and then the rest can be masked off with regular masking tape. And of course, before I did this whole thing, I did seal all the decals with gloss varnish from VMS. Now I have the canopy masking removed as well. Everything looks nice and clean, so it's really high time to mess everything up with some oil paint. So let's go. Actually, let's wait with that a bit and let's drill out the exhaust, because you saw that I haven't had the exhaust put in yet. And that's because I was putting them off for a period of time, but now let's quickly smash them out and let's have them done. But they don't have any holes in them, which is quite a bummer, but luckily it's quite easy to rectify that problem if you have a nice little Dremel like this one. And of course I would be lying if I would say that it's not a nerve-wracking thing to do, because one slip of the hand and the whole thing is gone and you won't recover that. But as you can see, they look quite nice. But also let's focus on the props, because I haven't really talked about that. And you can see that I use some white base, then I put on the red base like so. Both of them are for mission models, just saying. And after the red I put on some gloss varnish like so. Looking sharp, looking sharp. Now the propeller blades got the treatment of Black Mission Models primer, then I masked off the end and I gave them a quick paint of Mission Models white, and then I used Mission Models yellow on top of the white, like that. Yeah, you want to use white under yellow and red to make the color more vibrant. I heard that some other people use like pink, for example. That can work, but white is my go-to method. And for the props I use satin varnish to seal the deal, and then put on some decals and then another layer of satin varnish to seal that deal as well. And now it comes to the assembly. For the cap I use the slow drying cement from Tamiya, because it's much more thicker in viscosity than the fast drying one, and I just wanted to have it in specific places, so I don't want it to run around the place and potentially damage all the paintwork that I did. And now the whole thing is done, and I think I am very pleased how it looks. The gloss and the satin varnish mixed together give a really nice sheen to it. But let's not dilly-dally any longer and start the panel line wash, which is my usual mixture of black and brown oil paints with some odorless thinner mixed in to make it really nice, thin and flowy. As you can see, I was trying to keep a more frugal approach this time, so not smothering the whole thing in wash, but I still wanted to have all the rivet detail and panel lines popping a bit. And then still have some wash left over for some dirtying. And this is where I really like to have the black and brown mixed, because the brown gives a more brownish hue to the dirty layer that we'll leave behind. As you can see here, I think this is the best way to see that you have this really brownish tint now to the metal, and I actually quite like this kind of look. I think it is a close representation of dirt accumulation on the surface. Now, after I painted the exhaust parts with the same steel extreme metal color from AK as the corresponding cowling panels, I'm using a bit of a rust paint to rust up the pipes that come out, the exhaust pipes. Hindsight 101, probably it's a good idea not to glue the props in place whilst you're still working on the cowling. After the exhaust, I did some gunmetal painting on the guns. You know, guns should be colored in gunmetal. It's in the name. After the whole fuel tank thing was finished, I did drill 2 holes in there. And I drilled another 2 holes in the wings on both sides where the fuel tank would connect to the plane. And luckily there are 2 tiny divots there on the plastic, so you can't really miss those places. And now I'm using some super glue and glue in 2 copper pipes from Albion Alloys into those little holes, like that. And then there is some bending involved, because how the pipes connect to the plane aren't straightforward. The back one goes into front and the front one goes into the back. Or at least that's what you can see on the pictures. And to be honest, they aren't really perfectly representing how it looked in real life, but it's good enough. It's just a representation, you know, a tiny bit of extra detail that makes everything look nice. And after they were glued in, I used some silver and colored them in, because it wasn't really made out of copper in the first place. And with this, my friends, I call the whole project done. Overall, I'm satisfied how the whole thing turned out, but you can see that I did overdo the exhaust and gun port stains a bit, and yeah, that's something that it's a write-off, really. I can't really do anything about that at this point. But never mind, these things happen. Sometimes we just have to live with our mistakes and then move on. Overall, it's a decent little kit, and it's quite refreshing to have the Mustang in some kind of different marking other than, you know, the usual USA or RAF ones. And of course, I also really wanted something Swedish in my lineup, and I was thinking about getting the Saab Draken, but I'm not in the mood for jets yet, or at least not the modern ones. I'm still enjoying my time in the World War II era. And regarding the Mustangs, well, I'm still tempted to do another one at some point, but in a Japanese captured markings, because that's the other concept which I want to try out, these captured and alternative markings that you can play around with. Do let me know if you like to see one of those made as well. And with that, I think we have really reached the end, and I shouldn't ramble any longer. I'm hoping that you managed to stick around until this very end. I do apologize that it took so long to put this video together. But let's wrap things up really now. As I always say in the end, please like and subscribe, and see you on the next one. Bye bye.